is Mark Szybist, a Williamsport native and staff attorney for Penn Future. He works out of their Wilkes-Barre office and focuses on legal issues related to Marcellus shale development. Mark has been instrumental in clarifying the situation here in the Loyalsock State Forest and helping us to understand some of the legal complexities and subtleties. With that, please help me welcome Mark Szybist.
Thanks everybody for coming out today. It's a great turnout, especially on a pretty bad weather day today. As Ralph noted, I'm going to explain some of the legal issues that are really what we're talking about today in terms of how to protect the area. Today, the Loyalsock State Forest encompasses 114,000 acres. 100 years ago, though, there wasn't any such thing as the Loyalsock State Forest. All the land, all 114,000 acres, were in private ownership. Many of them in the hands of lumber companies, which timbered off thousands and thousands of acres, many, many tens of thousands of trees. Today, we're primarily concerned with 25,000 acres in northern Lycoming County. In the 1930s, the Commonwealth bought those acres. It's 25,621. They bought that land from a company called the Central Pennsylvania Lumber Company. But when the Commonwealth bought the land, it did not acquire the oil and gas rights underneath. As most of you know, in Pennsylvania, as in most other states, you can divide the ownership of the surface of the land from ownership of the oil and gas and the other minerals underneath. And that's what happened in this case. The Commonwealth bought the land, but the owner of the land prior to that, Commonwealth or the Central Pennsylvania Lumber Company, reserved an interest in all the oil and gas under the land. Later, the Central Pennsylvania Lumber Company lost the land. It was acquired, or lost the oil and gas rights. They were acquired by an individual named Clarence Moore. Still later, they were acquired by Anadarko and by another corporation called the International Development Corporation. And that's where things stand today. Anadarko and International Development Corporation own the oil and gas rights under these 25,000 acres. Sorry, everybody hear me now? Yes. Okay. So one question we have is, where are these 25,000 acres? We're not exactly sure. We have the deeds that show the transactions by which Anadarko and IDC acquired these interests. But the deeds are hard to read. We don't know exactly where these 25,000 acres, where Anadarko and IDC owns the mineral rights are, except that they're in northern Lycoming County, and in this general area. As I'll explain in a minute, we're trying to get the state to explain where this land is. But before I get to that, I want to talk briefly about what rights the state and Anadarko and IDC have given their respective ownership positions. As a general rule in Pennsylvania, when one person owns the surface estate of the land and another person owns the oil and gas rights under the land, the oil and gas estate is considered the dominant estate, and the surface estate is called the servient estate. And what that means in practice is that the person who owns the oil and gas can make reasonable use of the surface that he doesn't own in order, to the extent necessary, to extract the oil and gas underneath. That's established law, and there's really not much prospect of that changing in a general way anytime soon. That's bad news generally for areas where the state owns the surface, state forests and state parks, but somebody else owns or controls the oil and gas rights. The good news for the Loyalsock State Forest, for the areas around Rock Run, is that of these 25,000 acres where Anadarko and IDC own the mineral rights, there are almost 19,000 acres where this general rule does not apply, where the state, in fact, has much greater rights than it does under the general rule. And the reason for this is the particular language in the deed by which the Commonwealth acquired the land way back in the 1930s. When the Central Pennsylvania Lumber Company sold this 18,000 plus acre area to the Commonwealth, it reserved the oil and gas rights. But it distinguished in the deed between ownership on one hand and the right to use the surface to get the oil and gas out on the other. that's a distinction that's not always made. And the general rule that I talked about presupposes that those rights are all intertwined, they're all in one bundle. In this deed, they were explicitly separated. And that deed also put a 50-year limitation on the right of the lumber company, today Anadarko and IDC, to use that, to use their rights, to use the surface, to get out the oil and gas. That deed was made in 1933. The 50-year term expired in 1983, quite a long time ago. What this means today is that Anadarko and IDC own the mineral rights under this 18,000 plus acre area, but they have no legal right to use the surface unless the Commonwealth visits it. And this isn't just our interpretation of the deed. There were a series of court cases back in the 1980s and the 1990s where the Pennsylvania courts looked at this language. It was actually a dispute between the Commonwealth and Clarence Moore at the time as to who owned the rights, the oil and gas rights to begin with. And the court decided that Clarence Moore owned the oil and gas rights, but that the state had this right to use the surface after the expiration of the 50-year term. Now, for the other 6,000 acres that we're talking about, we're not sure that the state has the same rights. But I think the key for today is to understand that for this larger parcel, it's almost 80%, the state has extensive rights, exclusive rights, to keep Anadarko out if it chooses to. What's happening right now? Well, if you spent any time in the forest, in this area in the past year and a half, you probably stumbled across seismic testing activities. The cables, the flags, sometimes the workers themselves in their trucks. They wouldn't be there had the Commonwealth not given them permission to be there. So we know something's afoot. We don't know exactly what. And despite repeated requests from Ralph and others, the Commonwealth is declining to tell us exactly what's going on. So yesterday, RDA, Penn Future, the Pennsylvania Forest Coalition, the Sierra Club, the Keystone Trails Association, and the Appalachian Mountain Club, we joined forces to send a letter to the DCNR, to Secretary Richard Allen, setting forth our understanding of what the legal situation is up here, and making certain requests. What we requested is for the DCNR to publish maps that show us exactly where this acreage is, where the 25,000 acres are, where this 18,000 plus acre parcel is, where the 6,000 acre parcel is. We've asked the Commonwealth to conduct environmental impact studies for any area that where Anadarko and IDC might have the legal right to develop the land. And we've asked them to make those studies public. And finally, we've asked the Commonwealth to hold public meetings concerning what's going on right now. All the negotiations right now, and we think there are negotiations going on between the state and Anadarko and IDC, are happening behind closed doors. We haven't been admitted to them, despite the fact that this is a public resource. It's state forest land. You and I and all the taxpayers pay for it with our tax dollars. And we think that given the value that this has to so many people, as evidenced by your presence today, and by the extraordinary sensitivity of a lot of the resources there, the public should have a say in what happens there. And that's what we requested of the state. Again, this letter was just sent yesterday. We don't know how soon we'll get a response. We hope we do, and we'll put pressure on the DCNR to make sure we do. The basic point, you kind of boil it down to 3 points. One, this is an extraordinary public resource. Two, the Commonwealth has extraordinary legal powers to protect that resource. Again, as a general rule, when somebody else owns the oil and gas rights, the Commonwealth powers are very limited. Here, they are much stronger than they would be ordinarily. And three, because of the high level of the public interest in this resource, the state needs to let the public have a say in what happens here. Now, we have some legal arguments that we think back up those claims, that we think require the state to do those things that we've asked the state to do. But legal power doesn't work by itself. It's implemented by people within the government, and those people will respond to your concerns, which is why it's so important, as Ralph said, for people to contact your representatives, to contact the DCNR, to make known your concerns about this area, and to ask the DCNR to do the right thing. I can answer questions after the fact. I think everybody's going to speak, and then we're all going to be available to answer questions. So I know it's a kind of complicated situation. I'll leave it there for now and answer questions later.